I think ultimately when we think about regulation, we need to think about the control people deserve and need in order to make informed decisions.
We see elected representatives are increasingly being targeted by disinformation, and we're seeing that they're increasingly self-selecting out.
You're listening to the National Security Podcast, the show that brings you expert analysis, insights and opinion on the national security challenges facing Australia and the Indo-Pacific, produced by the ANU National Security College.
Welcome to the National Security Podcast. I'm Sally Bulkeley, Deputy Head of the ANU National Security College, and today's podcast is being recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today I'm delighted to introduce our special guests, Tanya Notley and Ika Trijsburg, to discuss the convergence of misinformation, media literacy and democratic resilience. Dr. Tanya Notley is a professor in the School of Arts and Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. She is internationally recognised for her extensive experience working with NGOs, government agencies, universities and the United Nations agencies in the areas of digital inclusion and media literacy. Dr. Notley is a founding member of the Australian Media Literacy Alliance, serving as the co-chair between 2020 to 2023. And for the past 3 years, Tanya has been working with a team of researchers to examine the everyday experience of misinformation in Australia and to look at how media literacy can be used to address this challenge. Ika Trijsburg is Director of Urban Analytics at the ANU Institute for Infrastructure in Society in the Crawford School for Public Policy and Head of Democracy and Diplomacy at Municipal Association of Victoria. Ika leads the Disinformation in the City project across 5 Australian universities, which she initiated within the Melbourne Centre for Cities. She was the lead author of the world first Disinformation in the City Response Playgroup in 2024, co-created with 40 cross-sector experts globally. Ika has provided policy guidance to key actors globally, including cities, national governments, G7RM, Council of Europe and UN Habitat. Ika and Tanya, welcome to the National Security Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally.
I thought we might start off firstly at looking at the concepts of misinformation and disinformation. And Ika, if we could start with you first. We hear the words misinformation and disinformation constantly, but why do they matter so much right now for democracy?
Thank you. I think they matter so much right now for everything. They've been ranked the top global risk twice now in the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, and this year have been pipped at the top place, but still ranked second. So it's pretty hard to overstate the significance of mis and disinformation. When we're looking specifically at democracy, there's sort of 4 key areas where we see impact. The first is around elections and governance, so calling into question the integrity of electoral agencies, but also manipulating voter behaviour and the ways that we can use lies, we can use fabricated information to sway public opinion, and also in governance, in the experience of those who are elected to govern us, in the way they're targeted, and in what that means in terms of the way that they are able to make decisions together. Then there's policy making. So we know there are also particularly certain areas of policy making that are particularly targeted by disinformation, whether that's around trying to create false impressions of public opinion through astroturfing or other misrepresentation, whether it's around providing falsified scientific evidence, or around trying to create polarization around particular issues and drive wedges where we have existing social fault lines. Then there's institutional trust. This impacts things like public participation, it impacts social license, it impacts the way that we interact with the institutions that serve us and that govern us, and through social cohesion. Disinformation is something that drives significant division in our communities, and that also erodes our capacity to function democratically.
Thanks, Ika. Tanya, do you have anything further to say on that as well? I know there's quite a few symptoms that were outlined just then by Ika in regards to misinformation, disinformation.
Yeah, well, I would agree with all of those, but I think one of the consequences is the level of concern people have about this issue. So it's a growing anxiety, and there are consequences to that, to people feeling like this is a real problem that's not being addressed properly, and their ability to make informed decisions feels diminished. But I think, it's important to remember, of course, misinformation has always existed. People have always created it for political, social, financial reasons. What I think, has really changed now is in quite a short period, really, relatively speaking, is the technologies that are now mediating almost all of our information access. So, for one, we have so much information available to us, and this is actually becoming, and this really came out from our research, really overwhelming for people. When people feel information overload, they feel stress, they feel anxiety. And one of the really worrying things is that it leads them to news and information avoidance, where they just can't really handle anymore. So that even further exasperates the problem, because they're not then getting access to that high quality, more trustworthy information that they would otherwise be actively seeking out. So, that the weight of this, people in Australia and people all around the world are really feeling, and that really came out a very stark finding from our research.
Tanya, you make a really good point about people feeling overwhelmed by the wealth of information that's both solicited and unsolicited information that comes into their information exchange. Where do everyday Australians mostly encounter misinformation without realising it? So that feeling of overwhelmingness is there, it's conscious, but there's this subconscious activity taking place, no doubt, as well, to get to that point.
Yeah, so, as you mentioned, we've been working on this research project for the past 3 years, and that's with a team of researchers from my own university, Western Sydney, Queensland University of Technology, University of Canberra, and RMIT. And we really wanted to understand this everyday experience of misinformation. It's actually really hard to get at, because, you can do things like a survey and ask about people's experience, but that's a very different thing to kind of recording it in situ. And in fact, what we ended up doing was a host of quantitative and qualitative methods that really complement one another. So yes, we did the national survey. We tested over 2,000 adults to see if they are able to verify information when they try to do that. And then we also did qualitative research, like a diary study, looking at how people are making everyday decisions about who and what to trust in an average week. And we did follow-up interviews. So it's this incredibly rich data set that we have learnt so much from. What we learned from the national survey, which represents the Australian population, is that the most commonly used form of media is social media. That is the form of media people are using on the most regular basis. And what we can see is that the more social platforms you're using, the more likely you are to report regularly encountering misinformation. There's a very strong association, very strong link, no one will be surprised, between social media use and misinformation. So this is a real challenge, how we deal with those spaces. Of course, it's addressing, misinformation on social media isn't a panacea. It's coming from all different sources. But there's a very strong link there. And we could really see that when people saved examples across the week, the majority of them came from social media. The majority of them were sources that people did not follow, did not want to see content from. People feel out of control of their information feeds, and that is a real challenge.
I actually partook in that activity when we last met to look at what was coming through the feed, both solicited and unsolicited. You take 5 minutes a day and all you have to do is write down what are some of the promotions you're receiving or what's some of that news feed. And interestingly, it had me in the demographic of 70 years plus. So what's fundamentally changed in how information spreads? Is it platforms? Is it algorithms? I think just taking that example of my experience, I felt like my algorithm had been compromised, for example. But then I'd been on some other platforms that might have resonated with that. Is there some trend that you have found, or is it ubiquitous across social media?
Well, I think, one of the big challenges as researchers, but also just as citizens, is that not only is our information feed individualised, it's opaque. And we really don't know what other people are seeing. And that makes it really challenging to even have a conversation about misinformation and what it looks like for us and why we're getting it. Certainly, algorithms, which are driven by commercial technology companies wanting to make money, are at the root of this issue. They haven't been designed to give us the best quality information that we're looking for at the time. They have been designed to make money for those platforms. And that's certainly, an issue that we could see again and again, that content was being put in front of people because of vested interest, because of commercial motivations. And sometimes it's easier to spot that than others. People form trusted relationships with information providers that might be social media influencers online, and it can be harder to see how those actors are making money from, more follows, more people viewing their content. So there is a lack of understanding about how money is made. And I think, I'm often surprised about that our knowledge hasn't kept up to date with these changes in terms of the business models that drive the distribution of this media.
So, Tanya, we're talking about trusted relationships through society erring along social media ownership. Ika, this makes a very difficult environment for us in practicing democracy. How does misinformation alter political decision-making and public trust on the basis of that?
Yeah, similarly in a variety of ways. So I focus at the local level, and we look at the ways that political decision-making and public trust and other aspects of civic functioning are impacted at the local level by disinformation, but also what capacities we already have and can develop to effectively respond. In terms of the ways that we're impacted, as I mentioned earlier, the scientific evidence base upon which decisions are made is potentially corrupted. There's the fake evidence base, there's fake think tanks that are increasingly generating and disseminating reports, as well as things like astroturfing and the misrepresentation of public opinion, which makes it really difficult for decision makers to understand what their constituents want of them when there's so many fake impressions that are provided by them. Within the chamber, we see elected representatives are increasingly being targeted by disinformation, and we're seeing that they're increasingly self-selecting out. We're seeing that in Australia. We're also seeing that in other parts of the world. But it's such a significant issue that that observatories have been established in other parts of the globe, in North America and in Europe, to monitor that particular issue. And we know that disproportionately targets women and racialized groups, and we're risking losing a wealth of diversity in decision-making and representation that we really rely on as a thriving multicultural democracy. And then we're seeing increased polarization and hostilities that are driven by disinformation. We're seeing the hijacking of public participation and governance processes. We saw a whole spate of local governments closing their chambers for a period of time. And there's a distrust of community processes that comes with that, not just from community members, but also then from those who are governing, as they're increasingly faced by those hostilities and attacks. Then it leads to tighter protections, then it leads to less engagement, then it leads to greater distrust, and then we continue in this cycle. And there's a valuable report that was released last year, I believe it was, looking particularly at the role of trust in the way that Australian governments relate to communities, not just in the way that communities relate to government. And that's very important when we're looking at this as a bidirectional or as a multi-directional trust relationship that we need to build and safeguard if we're going to effectively respond to disinformation.
And Ika, it can go both ways. There can be a disenfranchisement through politics on what's happening in the social media scene, particularly a hesitancy to provide voice where voice might be misrepresented. But there's the flip side where misinformation might be at the benefit of political parties as well. What responsibility do political leaders carry when misinformation benefits them too? I think we see it globally. The global impacts of misinformation do carry an effect in the local environment as well. What role do politics have to play in that?
I mean, political leaders carry huge responsibility. They're elected to represent the interests of their constituents, and those constituents are threatened by health disinformation, climate disinformation, gender disinformation, all these things. Disinformation is a risk across the board. It's a risk for business. It's a weapon that can be wielded. It's a risk for emergency services, for hospitals, for the systems that we're relying on to live with and to live healthy lives and to live prosperous lives. So from that perspective, there's a heavy burden on political leaders. But political leaders are also significant users of disinformation, which is, I presume, at the core of this question. For this reason, the Welsh Parliament at the moment actually is going through a process of pursuing a bill to try to stop politicians from lying, which many eyes around the world are watching with interest to see how that will play out, if that's possible, and who's going to determine who's lying and how that's going to be determined, and all those sorts of things. But it's got to the point where it's been recognised in many places, not just in Wales, that this is such a significant issue. And as voters, we actually need to demand better of political leaders when we see these behaviours. We also need better oversights and repercussions, whether that's through having a bill, as we've seen in Wales, or whether it's through code of conduct and those sorts of amendments that we've also seen in states and territories around Australia that have been increasingly amended. We also need peers to keep each other in line. So when we're talking about political representatives, we need the people next to them, not across the chamber, but next to them, to actually be helping to encourage people to see the long game a little bit more, and the impacts of democratic erosion, the impacts of institutional erosion of trust, and those sorts of things that are going to be detrimental now, but increasingly in the long term, because at the moment so much of politics is in that immediate winner takes all mentality and focused on the immediate victory, and there's a little regard for the ongoing impacts. And we have people in elected roles in Australia and overseas as well, increasingly, that express anti-democratic views. And this is part of a process that we're seeing globally play out that sort of reflects where that level of erosion within that particular bastion of democratic decision-making and representation sits.
We'll be right back.
In this disrupted world, Australia needs security professionals more than ever. Join the next generation studying at the ANU National Security College. Our programs uniquely fuse academic knowledge with practitioner experience and fit around your lifestyle, with study offered online and on campus. Follow the link in the show notes for more information about programs and scholarships. The ANU National Security College. Engaging minds for a secure Australia.
So as part of our community consultations last year as we journeyed around Australia, the topic of misinformation and understanding the source of truth popped up quite a lot. And there was an overwhelming sense from the people that we interviewed that education is absolutely needed at the moment to combat misinformation. And Tanya, when we met, we did discuss media literacy as an opportunity for managing misinformation, particularly for the individual. Be keen to hear from you what that term means. And if you had 1 hour with an Australian teenager to discuss media literacy, what would you teach them?
Okay. Thanks, Sally. Look, the Australian Media Literacy Alliance, which I'm a member of, define media literacy as the ability to critically engage with all forms of media. And to be media literate, you really need to be doing and increasing your capacity in 3 areas. So the first is your ability to ask meaningful, critical questions about the media that you consume and create. The second thing is that you need to understand the media environments you're using. And the third is that you need media ability so that you're able to access, use, analyze, and create media. So it's really about those 3 things together. There is no perfectly media literate person. And it's not a place that you reach, or even, that you can get to if you study a 3-year degree in media literacy. So instead, media is always changing. Our knowledge and critical thinking and our abilities need to adjust over time as well. Some people will be stronger in some areas because they're really passionate about one type of media because they've had a lot of experience in one area. But obviously, if you don't use a type of media like gaming or social media, you're going to have less knowledge and abilities in that area. So it really needs to centre around learners and what they need, because ultimately media literacy is about being able to use media to fully participate in society, and it's about being able to use media to make informed decisions. And so, education needs to support that. It needs to really respond to learners. So to take your example of the 13-year-old, look, I think where I would start, and this is probably my researcher hat, is to really ask them about what they're using, what their experience is. When do they think they're encountering misinformation? What does that look like for them? And that's because, like I said, media literacy should always be responsive to learners. But that would really give me some clues about, what might be useful for a teenager. And we assume, or we have assumed, that all teenagers are using media literacy all the time. Actually, my research shows it's way more complex than that. A lot of teenagers choose not to. They use it in very particular ways. So it's really quite varied. So I'd want to start by learning. But I think, what we know from our research is whether it's teenagers or whether it's adults, everyone wants to increase their ability to verify information online. And so, I'd be thinking about, well, what are the critical questions that we know that there's evidence around this, we know help you when you encounter some information and you're trying to make a decision whether it can be trusted or not. And the very first question is always, who created this and why? So those really simple critical questions actually have an impact. They actually get people to stop, deepen their thinking, and really start to use their brain to kind of interrogate what vested interest might be the person who's producing that content. But also I'd be asking, are there any claims made in this, and can I verify them from other sources? And I'd be teaching perhaps some basic fact-checking skills, which might include image verification of facts and claims, and how you kind of think about this and go about this. But having just studied, people's experience of misinformation over 3 years, one thing that we have learned is that it is absolutely impossible to fact check everything that you see in 5 minutes on social media, let alone a day or all the time. So actually the very first question we need to be asking, is this worth my time? And so this is what is referred to as critical ignoring. And I think if people are making more conscious decisions about what they want from their online experiences, what they're expecting, it becomes much easier then to say, not what I'm after, not what I'm looking for. I'm not even going to let that be processed in my brain, moving right along, and they just withhold any trust or distrust and move along. And that's really important because the amount of effort and money and time that goes into hijacking our attention is, phenomenal and overwhelming. So that's one tool that we have to respond to that. So I'm not even going to give that my attention. I'm not going to spend time fact-checking that because that would take up my time, be a whole process, and is not necessary for me. So, I think with media literacy, it's about a more comprehensive understanding of not just you should fact check everything, that you really need to be making these sort of informed decisions along the way about what you're looking for, what you need to ignore, and when it's worth your time to fact check something.
That's incredibly valuable advice, particularly for Australians who have other pressures in mind at the moment, or have quite big mental loads as well. It's the ability to be able to absorb all of that encompassing and bring your whole self to the context of socials as well.
That's right. But it's taxing on people. Even when you're doing that, it's taxing and people don't want it. And it's not so easy as like, I've, taken back control of my information environment. I think ultimately when we think about regulation, we need to think about the control people deserve and need in order to make informed decisions. So if I never want to see a source or a particular type of content, I should be able to do that. I should be able to have some control. These are public spaces that mediate so much critical information that ultimately we need to ensure that people can take back some control.
So, Ika, then in a world where media literacy is up and alive and it's reaching all aspects of the Australian community, people are making good choices on their social media and their other feeds that are coming in. From a democratic standpoint, what does a media literate citizen look like?
I think extending on what Tanya's just provided as a picture there, I think there's also the aspect of digital literacy in alignment with media literacy and sort of lifting the veil on the disinformation machine beyond content, being able to understand and analyze content and make sense of it. Really kind of removing the pixie dust on AI and algorithmic bias and addictive content and those sorts of things. If we can explain those, I often say if we can explain these things simply enough to print it on the side of a coffee cup, that's the level that we've achieved what we need to achieve, because these things need to be broken down into a way that every person could understand, because they are having a huge impact on our lives. And we need to provide the tools for people to sort through that information, make informed decisions about what they're consuming. And we need to provide the conditions to regulate and promote healthy conditions for that consumption to happen within, just like we do with other forms of consumption and pollution. I think we need to not see this as something that's an individual burden that people need to fully develop the capacities to respond to in isolation, but actually look at things like the social determinants of health. How do we apply that model to the issues of disinformation and information pollution? We don't expect people to just not smoke, for example. We see that the individual costs and the collective costs of that individualized decision-making in that space, which is also prone to manipulation of those with economic interests, is not feasible as a fully individualized response. And so we have frameworks for that. We can bring those into our response around information integrity. We look at core infrastructure for healthy functioning society that includes infrastructure, the built conditions, so to speak, within which our information flows, the quality of the inputs and having healthy alternatives, the institutional response, the individual drivers and the risk factors that lead people into consuming in a way that's not beneficial for them, and how we can address those, and creating the conditions and capacities to enable healthy individual choices. Those are all part of the social determinants of health framework that we can draw on in our understanding of how we can effectively and comprehensively respond to information integrity and information pollution.
Ika, this is a very thoughtful appreciation for how individuals don't need to carry the misinformation burden alone. And education takes us so far, but there are other scaffoldings that need to take place as well for the Australian community to feel safe, particularly on the media environment. Tanya, do you have anything further to add to that?
One thing that we've seen when it's come to tech regulation is actually the public have been hardly engaged at all, even though social media has such an immense impact on their lives. And so we've seen policy just rush through, bills put to Parliament where there was no public discussion and people didn't understand what it would mean, and they failed those bills. So I think one thing about that media literacy can really do is increase, I love that expression that Ika used, like removing the pixie dust. For a media literacy approach is absolutely about media knowledge. Like, we can't escape needing to know about the media environments we use to get information. That is critical, but it can happen in many different ways and many different forms, through news articles, through, libraries, through our family, so many different ways. And it is really important, because until people feel confident about their knowledge, they're not going to be confident about advocating for particular policy responses, and we need that from the public. And I think that's really been missing. So I think that's one critical area that media literacy also contributes to, because nobody would ever say that, the only response we need is education. But there have been many moments in the past where people have proposed, magic bullets, like we just need the right policy and everyone should be on board with that. We just need the platforms to do X, Y, and Z. We're never going to have the perfect conditions, and we need to have a multi-pronged approach. And I think now, I'm really heartened that that is widely accepted. And, education is one piece of this, and it's one way that people can take back some control and feel like they're able to make more informed decisions.
We've sort of built ourselves through this podcast to listeners an idea of media literacy, education, infrastructure, conditions, and whatnot. Tanya, starting with you, are you optimistic or pessimistic about democracy's ability to adapt to the new digital age and the challenges that go with it?
Well, later this year, our research team will be releasing a book, and it's called Living with Misinformation. And when we submitted this book proposal a couple of years ago, the book was actually called Combating Misinformation. And that reflected, the way we were seeing things, that you could protect yourself, you could do things to put up a kind of, magic shield, that you could find some ways to kind of get away from it, and that you could fight. The name change really reflects years of deep analysis in our research data. Now, Living with Misinformation, when I heard it and we knew that was the right title right away, was, oh my gosh, that sounds quite defeatist and pessimistic. And I'm an optimist at heart, so I was pretty worried about that. But actually, I think it's not pessimistic. I think, like I said, we've had a decade looking for magic bullets. If everyone just does this or that, we'll get out of this situation. I think it's a sign of maturity that we've now moved beyond that we need to not be looking for simple solutions, but to live within the complexity of what we have, to know what we can do, but also know our limits, because that can help protect us as well. One thing that we did see in our research was a lot of overconfidence, and some groups are more likely to be overconfident than others, and that's a dangerous place to be as well. So I think being humble and reflective and just accepting that this is always around us, and it will be. And that's not defeatist. There's things that we should do to improve this situation. We can. But we need to be aware of that, and find techniques and methods and approaches to live with that reality that misinformation is always around us.
And Ika, I'd be interested in your views too, with the released playbook of 2024. All is not lost is what I'm hearing.
No, absolutely. And I echo that sentiment, Tanya. When we were designing the Disinformation in the City response playbook, we made a deliberate decision to make it blue sky colouring, because we felt, having gone through this extraordinary process of working with 40 experts from different sectors around the world to co-create this playbook, that it had actually been a profoundly optimistic exercise, and that we all were feeling hopeful. And we had three models, I guess, within the playbook that really guided that hope for us. The first being, we have the capacity to really extend our understanding of disinformation response really into the anticipatory phase, through the active phase, and into the recovery and resilience building phase. And that actually, by applying a more resilience-focused lens, it really changes the way that we move also from that combating narrative to how do we work effectively with this new threat that's in our environment so that we can still thrive and so that we're working together in constructive ways. And the other two models are about really effective working between levels of government. And we're already seeing that. We're seeing the forging of new strategic information pathways, of new kinds of partnerships in response to this collective threat. And that's been a really, really wonderful thing for us to experience in these past couple of years. And then the third is about really understanding what are the strengths and capacities and legitimacies of different actors, different sectors within communities, beyond communities, and how can they contribute those? How do we effectively bring together all of those strengths that we already have, all of those frameworks and all of those understandings? I gave an example from public health before. How do we bring those all together so that we have a network of trusted institutions and information and people and places that actually are working together and mutually reinforcing each other in a way that allows for democratic dissent? It enables us to disagree well. It enables all of these things because we actually have those foundations. So I feel profoundly optimistic about that. It's a huge challenge, but I think we absolutely have the tools to meet it.
Well, I think we're very lucky to have both you, Ika, and Tanya in the community helping us to make sense of all of this that's happening around us, particularly as emerging national security issue. I think it continues to evolve. It continues to be quite large in scale, and certainly the sense-making that's taking place at the moment across both documents is just wonderful. We're almost out of time, and I'd like to ask one more. This is the fun question, if that's okay. So it's 2030, and we're all in our information environment that has somewhat changed. What does a healthy democratic information space look like? Tanya, would you like to get us started on that one?
For me, it would be people having more control over information environments. And, you know, the reason that I'm optimistic if that happens, that will be a good thing, is because our national surveys show us again and again people don't like being duped. They don't accept misinformation. They're not happy with it. And they're upset by it. They're concerned by it. So I feel that if people are given more control to take out, to suck out all that information they didn't ask for in their personal environments, that'll take a lot of stress off people, and it will make it much easier for them to seek out information. And ultimately, for me, it would look like people feeling more confident than they do about being able to participate in society using media in a reflective way and being able to make informed decisions with media. Our research shows that confidence is low and that some groups are less confident than others. So I think if we get this right, we'll be really addressing some of the systemic inequities that prevent people from fully and actively participating in political, social and cultural life.
Ika, I'd be keen for your thoughts as well. I think there's, only 29 liberal democracies left in this world. We get to 2030. What's your vision?
I agree. I think control, understanding, really having an understanding of what the information environment is, and a conception of that as an environment that we engage in, as collective infrastructure that we are constantly accessing and contributing to, and that people feel confident to participate in that our institutions recognise the value of strengthening and protecting that, and that we're working in collaboration across sectors and across nations to strengthen and reinforce democracy in that way.
Tanya, Ika, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here on today's podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
If you're interested in reviewing the two publications further that we discussed today, there is Living with Misinformation, a Media Literacy Approach by Tanya Notley, Michelle Dzouani, Sora Park, TJ Thompson and Amy Hourigan, and Ika's World First Disinformation in the City Response Playbook that was published in 2024. Both will be available on the website.
Thank you for listening to the National Security Podcast. We welcome listener feedback and suggestions at any time, so please get in contact at natsecpod@anu.edu.au. For more important conversations about Australia's national security, please subscribe to the podcast, our YouTube channel, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter to receive the latest updates.